I work with UNDRR, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, here right in Geneva. And I've worked for UNDRR for almost 18 years. 9 years here in Geneva, doing many, many different things. I'm now in charge of several, what I would say, very interesting programs like Wars into Action. I won't go into in detail about that. It's not the issue of this introduction. I've worked also as a regional head for Latin America, well, for the Americas in general, for UNDRR in the past, and in information management and technology for the same organization. Before that, I've worked in many other circumstances in the organization, drug control for 8 or 9 years, migration, private sector, and basically that. My background study-wise is a type of operations research and applied mathematics, neuropsychology, and also aviation and disaster risk reduction, which I've studied also as like courses and those kind of things to get some more theoretical knowledge besides the experience, which is very important. So that will be my introduction.
Thank you very much, Dave, for willing to talk to ADN. So do you believe it is possible to achieve the first 2 global targets of the Sendai framework by 2030? The first target is to reduce global disaster mortality, and the second target is to reduce the number of people affected by disasters.
I think it is possible. It doesn't mean it is possible. I will try to make my answers quite short because there's so much to be said. And I think it is possible if people and governments do enough with the knowledge that already exists in order to implement things we already know will help to do so. There is that we do not know exactly the effects like increased population growth in certain areas or climate change will have. Hazards can change, patterns can change. So it is always possible that we try to predict things that are not always predictable, but as far as what we see now continues, if the right measures are taken and there's a bit more consciousness at the levels that we need to have that awareness, then I think it is certainly possible. The knowledge exists, the tools exist, and I think most of the things that we would need to know in order to do so, we can apply. But there's still a lack of political will. There's also a lack of, let's say, what I would call it inertia. In order to change policies, for instance, it just takes time also. And in order to invest, you need, in disaster risk reduction in this case, you need to be able to get funds for that. That means you have to create mechanisms also, not only locally but nationally, in order to get the funds. You could get them from the private sector, but you also need to get them from. How does that happen? Better economic policies in general, tax returns, etc., etc., etc. It means that many things that could be done by governments, for instance, it's not only governments that are important in this, but let's focus right now on that, implies that you have a very long time frame that will be necessary to work with. But yes, I do think it is certainly possible. It exists, and there's a lot more political will than 20 or 30 years ago.
Okay, I think you have answered my second question, but I shall still ask you, in no more than about a reduction in disaster deaths.
I cannot answer that question in 2 phrases. I do not think there's one single thing here, but I would be partial. I'm not giving you the answer yet. I do not think, again, that governments are the clue or the most, maybe not even the most important factors in many places. But through governments, a lot of change take place, and you need a central, let's say, kind of methodology and policy in order to affect change and to monitor it. So I would say if governments, that would be my answer, if governments become more prone, more willing to invest, either with human resources or money, to apply methodology and knowledge we already know and to coordinate better, then I think measures can be taken, both in per se or prevention per se, as well as preparedness and response to reduce death in the next years. I think it's very often possible. Basic answer is finished, but as an addendum, it is always possible that we get big disasters. Don't forget that we have many statistics over a year where they can be skewed. And it can happen, suppose you have, it's of course very theoretical, you can have things that we don't expect now. You can have an asteroid impact. It's happened many times in the history of Earth. And again, why not? It will happen eventually.
Yeah.
We don't know when. But there can be many other basic hazards that we haven't expected. And then, of course, then you have impacts that will be much larger. And it's always possible that happens. So statistics can be skewed. Maybe things we haven't measured in the last years can occur again. So we have to always be careful of what we think will happen.
Thank you. So in your view, which type of organization should take the lead in a country's effort to reduce disaster deaths?
There are so many different countries and regions, different situations of problems or capacities. Again, I would not dare to say there's one single recipe. In UNDRR, some people think, or many people think, efforts on a single, let's say, measure, it would not be bad to work, for instance, with national coordination mechanism or national platforms. I know a very abstract term, but it can be a means to have actors, government, civil society, NGOs, etc., sit together to plan and do things together. So it is certainly not enough. It's just only a part of the coordination. It doesn't mean there's not necessarily much funds there that's coming to that. But if you have to work with something, it's maybe the awareness and the will to work at a small level first and set into motion a kind of formal or informal, it doesn't matter, cooperation or coordination mechanism that will bring more actors together, use the tools that are needed, and then start to create political momentum that will make it possible to work together with the instances that you have in that country and that are best fit to react to the problems, or not to react, or to work with the issues, the capacities, and towards resolving the problems that you have in that specific situation or country. In some other countries, it may be media. You can maybe use media in order to mobilize countries or to make them change policies or become more aware of the rights that citizens have to be protected or informed or risk informed by the governments. So again, I would not want to say one single thing about that, what you just asked, because it's so different depending on the place and even the time to move in that situation. I don't know if that satisfies your question, but that's what I would say if I want to be honest here.
Okay. Are you aware of any good practices in reducing disaster deaths?
Yes, of course. There is hundreds. I cannot just list them right here, but I could if I had a few hours to do so. I can give just a few examples without going into the details. For instance, several countries, Central Asia, for instance, but not only there, are engaging in risk assessments. What does it mean? If you have risks identified, it means you can do something with that knowledge to reduce those risks, or to have people informed, or to make things happen on a smaller or local scale, sometimes even very small efforts, but they can still reduce death. Also, better preparedness, better organization for evacuation, education, curricula changes that can use in many countries schools as a social agent to change minds and to train, etc., etc. I think there's hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of small scale and bigger examples. Doesn't mean they're all easily available, but they do exist. Then of course you have indigenous, even more difficult to access actually. You have, how do you call it, traditional or indigenous knowledge. I find that not always a very accurate term, but let's use it. Things that people know, maybe not always explicitly verbalized or documented, but there is so much wisdom that can teach us so many things, and especially in complex situations where we really have to start working with more feeling and knowledge for the planet Earth and everything that lives on it and in it. That awareness and wisdom, not always explicitly verbalized and documented, as I said, becomes all the way more important in the future. And I'm sure that with our better methodologies to gather knowledge from non-traditional sources, to that wisdom and translate it also in terms that many other people will understand, and to also build a bridge with the scientific society to make sure that that wisdom can be translated in those terms easily usable for most places, academic world, and let's say the pragmatic, materialistic, material, capitalistic world, and other places, of course, but not that are not basically very much in contact with their traditional and indigenous knowledge nowadays.
Okay, finally, what are the consequences of not reducing disaster deaths?
Well, the consequences is that it's obvious that you have so much more. I mean, it sounds very maybe too simplistic, but if you don't reduce disaster death, you have much more human suffering, of course. And now we are, of course, not only, by the way, we should not only focus on human death. We have an obligation as us the dominant species of this planet to also reduce the risk for other beings. Many risks that are actually caused by human beings. The way we build, the way we act, the way we cause risk by the management or the mismanagement of our natural resources. It means also that you will have a loss if we go to a more less emotional part. That's the sadness that the loss of human life involves for all of us, family, friends, and people you know and do not know. That causes a lot of hurt and pain. You, of course, by having more disaster death, you also reduce the human capital, of course. Not only directly, but also indirectly. Families that are broken up, education of children that are interrupted, and the scars that causes. Also the cost of recovery in all the senses. I won't go into the details because otherwise this interview would have to last hours or days. And such it means it undermines, of course, the development of a society in many, many ways. And it also causes, and I can go on, the fact that more people die. If you don't reduce disaster death, there is another effect. For instance, if most people wouldn't expect, for instance, of their communities or local authorities, for instance, or their governments, that something be done. Because most people have an idea of why people die in disasters, right? And why they are vulnerable. And it also undermines the confidence that people have in their own communities, their own fabric of life, support, social life, and their governments. So I think it also eats away the confidence that people have in their own countries if they don't see that serious efforts are undertaken to reduce risks and the number of deaths due to disasters. So that's some of the consequences I see of that.
Thank you very much for your time.
It's my pleasure.